Hello again and welcome, listeners, to Shallow Thoughts and Deep Shit. My name is Jefferson Lambert, and I'll be your host for this atrocity as I journey through the mind of a serial misanthrope. You can listen to this podcast for free at Spotify, Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, CastBox, Radio Public, and Spotify for podcasters. If you like what you hear, please rate the show, subscribe, and follow. You can also follow the show on Instagram, X, Facebook, and YouTube, where you can join for extra content, new episode notifications, and more. Don't forget, you can interact with each episode and post a comment or ask a question if you so desire. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for tuning in. Let's get started, shall we? Hello again and welcome to episode 18 of Shallow Thoughts and Deep Shit. I'm going to switch gears a little bit today and post a short story that I wrote in August of 1989 when I was 20 years old. It's just under 3,000 words, and I'll do my best to try not to mess this up. This is a story about a 14-year-old kid who lets his imagination get the best of him after he's caught peeping at the neighborhood weirdo. It's a work of fiction, and I really do not remember what inspired this story. Bon appetit is a French phrase that means have good appetite, enjoy your meal. Bon appetit. The sun was still setting to the west over the Zeckers house as I walked down Wasson Drive, going home after 4 games of stickball with the guys. A light breeze gently swayed the weeping willow trees on the side of the Judson's yard, and it made my New York Giants t-shirt stick to the cold sweat on my back. I loved the hot June nights when there was nothing to do on summer vacation. School was finally out, and junior high didn't start up until fall. Lights were just coming on in the split levels which lined the street, and the neighborhood was relaxing, getting ready for the night in the comfort of their air-conditioned homes. I passed the Widow McCarthy's house and took a right onto Sherwood Drive. 2 birds, perched atop the telephone lines, took to the air as I scuffed my feet along the pavement, walking at an even pace. No real hurry to get home tonight, I thought, as I watched the Morrisons' water sprinklers stream back and forth across their dry, brittle lawn. Tonight was Italian food night at my house. Mom always had sauce on the stove on Mondays. Last week was lasagna. God knows what was on for this week. I didn't mind Italian food, just that it got a little boring knowing what you're going to have week after week on the same day. I walked toward home with the sun setting at my back. The neighborhood was peaceful at this hour, and cars were scarce on Sherwood Drive. I stopped in front of the Fat Lady Marshall's house, as we like to call it. My shoelace was untied, and as I bent over to tie it, the streetlights popped on, illuminating the street with a dull orange light. I could hear the telephone wires above me humming, as if jammed with never-ending conversations. I heard Fat Lady Marshall yelling at her daughters, telling them they had better turn down that goddamn music now. Up the street a bit, I could hear the distinct sound of a shovel hitting the earth. The sound was coming from behind Mr. Jordan's house. The sound came again and again as I walked down the street listening. It was getting to be dark now, and I wondered what old man Jordan could be digging at right now. I continued down the street toward his house, which was to the left, hearing the steady rhythm of the shovel. I stopped at the foot of his lawn and listened. He was digging at something, all right, and I wondered what he was up to. His septic tank overflowed, maybe? His garden? At this hour? I studied the front of his shabby 3-bedroom run-down house. His lawn was overgrown with dry crabgrass, and dead sun-baked weeds nestled into the cracks in the asphalt on the driveway. Old paint was peeling badly from the siding, and the shutters were crooked and weathered in need of some fresh paint. The house had obviously been in neglect for some time and was in dire need of repair and cleaning. I stood and listened to the digging for another minute and finally walked straight up to the open garage and went to the gate on the right side of his house. Curiosity had gotten the best of me. I peered through a crevice in the rotted cedar fence and adjusted my eyes to the floodlight that beamed over the back porch. I could see old man Jordan in the middle of his back lawn with his shovel. Near his feet was a small pile of freshly dug earth and a white 5-gallon bucket. He stood there, in dirty overalls, with only one of the suspenders slung over his shoulder. He reminded me of Jed Clampett. Underneath the suspenders, he wore a dirty white t-shirt with light brown stains covering the front of it. In the middle of his fenced-in backyard was a lawn sprinkler which blanketed the weedy lawn with showers of cool water. I watched Jordan take a break from the digging and leaned on the shovel dug into his left armpit as he wiped the sweat from his brow with his right arm. I knew old man Jordan was labeled as a weirdo on our block. I've heard stories throughout the neighborhood about him, and he surely was the neighborhood freak. I even saw for myself last winter when the cops had to come because he got drunk on cheap vodka and went out and climbed the rungs on the telephone pole in front of his house. It was 10 degrees and the man was stark naked, 25 feet in the air, singing God Save the Queen at the top of his lungs. Everyone who lived in the neighborhood steered clear of him. People walking would take to the other side of the street when he was out in his front yard pretending to work. He was a misanthrope, never had any company, and rarely left the house. He sometimes stood in his yard and tinkered around and waited for someone to come by so he could suck them into a conversation about World War II or Nazism if he let them go that far. He was a nuisance, that much was for sure, but also harmless. Most people knew he meant well, but he was one of those people who didn't play with a full deck. I watched him as he resumed digging in the middle of his yard. He shoveled a fresh pile of dirt and got down on one knee and began sifting through it with his hands. He eventually found what he was looking for and wiped the dirt off of it and plopped it into the 5-gallon bucket by his side. He got to his feet again and went about the task of moving the sprinkler to a new spot on the lawn. This was comical to watch because he had to time the water just right so he wouldn't get wet and ended up getting sprinkled anyway. Pathetic is what he was, as I watched some more and then got bored. I had no idea what he was up to, and no interest either, so I turned to head home. Just as I took my first step backwards, I tripped over a garbage can lid and went tumbling downward, crashing into the 3 metal cans that lined up along the fence. They sounded like cymbals as they clanged together simultaneously, making a huge ruckus. Next, I heard Jordan's voice, followed by his footsteps. "Shit! Who the hell is over there?" he yelled. I was lying there, my face full of sweat, my mind numb with fear, and his footsteps getting closer. I scrambled to my feet as the cans clanged around some more. I was about to take off to the front yard when I heard the latch on the gate being opened in a hurry. Instead, I turned and met his piercing eyes as he lumbered through the gate. "What the hell are you doing here, boy?" he asked through his stained yellow teeth. His voice was coarse and strained. "Don't you know peeping Toms go to jail?" "I wasn't staring at you, Mr. Jordan," I told him. "Honest, I came around here looking for old Wheezy, my cat. She's been missing since yesterday morning," I lied as I bent to pick up his cans. "Now don't bother with that, boy," Jordan said as he scratched the white prickly hair on his chin and looked as if he were deciding some great punishment for my crime. "Ain't you Pete Tanner's kid?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Yeah, I am, but I gotta head home now for dinner. I don't think old Wheezy is back here anyway," I said, backing away, ready to make a run for it. "Well, what's your hurry, boy? It's not often I have company. Why don't you come in while I fix me my dinner?" he said as his face lit up. "Well, I really should be going now," I told him. I was being honest, too. I was scared. "Nonsense, boy," he said, coming toward me, motioning me through the open gate. "You can join me for a quick drink before you leave," he said, standing near the gate, waiting for me to oblige. "Okay," I agreed, "but only for a minute because I have to be home before full dark." I walked through the open gate and caught a whiff of him as I went by, thinking maybe I should just take off anyway. He smelled like dead roadkill rotting under the boiling sun. I knew I wasn't going to overstay my welcome. I went to the staircase that led up to the porch. "I'll be right there," he said as he went underneath the porch and turned off the sprinkler. The shower of water died and silenced as he went back to the yard and picked up the 5-gallon bucket and carried it with him, leaving the shovel behind. I followed him up the rickety porch steps that led to the kitchen. The inside of Jordan's house was just as shameful as the outside. Through the back door, we went into the kitchen, which reeked of rotting garbage. Dirty dishes were piled high in the sink, and the garbage can in the corner was overflowing, filled high above the rim. Jordan put his bucket down and trudged across the worn linoleum floor and fetched a glass from the cupboard, wiping the inside with a grubby-looking rag. "Got some cola for you, boy," he said, opening the refrigerator. He pulled out a 2-liter bottle of cheap bargain brand soda. "Take a load off your feet, boy." I took a seat at the kitchen table as he poured the drink, and I wondered how I let myself get into such a mess. Jordan plopped the drink in front of me and took his bucket to the counter by the stove. "I ain't got no ice, but at least it's already cold," he said. I took a sip of the soda and tried not to cringe at the flat, bitter taste. My palms were sweaty, and my forehead was popping sweat beads everywhere. I cursed myself for ever getting into this mess with this grubby old man. He was truly revolting. A plaque over the sink read, "Bless this house and all who enter." The dirty window above it confirmed that darkness had taken over the neighborhood. Jordan started going through the cabinets looking for something, and I forced down another sip of the rotten soda. I passed the next few minutes with small talk. School, vacation, and sports were all that I can think to talk about. I watched as Jordan placed a sieve on top of the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. He quickly scrubbed off a dinner plate and set it on the table next to me. "Tonight, I'm making my favorite," he said with a stupid grin on his face. Next to the plate, he placed a fork and napkin as a lump of snot dribbled from his nostril and rested on his upper lip. He felt the wet booger with his tongue and then wiped it off on the back of his wrist. I knew he would have gobbled that son of a bitch if I wasn't there. I had to get out. He went over to the sink and dumped the contents of the bucket into the sieve. He whistled a merry tune as he ran hot, steamy water over the sieve. I gulped down the rest of the soda, noticing the gooey brown stain at the bottom of my glass. I got up, trying to hold back the vomit that crept up my throat. "Thanks for the drink, Mr. Jordan. I really have to be going home for dinner now," I told him as I got up from the table. I took a step toward the back door as he turned off the water and started draining the sieve by shaking it up and down and left to right. "Going so soon, boy?" he asked, as he turned from the sink and held the dripping sieve in front of him. For the first time, I saw what he was putting into the bucket in his backyard. The dripping sieve was full of slimy, squirming earthworms, each of them a good half an inch thick. He smiled when he saw my face turn to disgust. "Yes, my boy, worms. One of the finest foods a man can eat," he told me, as he took the sieve over to the table and started distributing them evenly over his plate. I was too dumbfounded to say a word. I wanted to run out of that kitchen as fast as I could, but my legs froze as I watched the worms move sluggishly around Jordan's plate. The hot water not only cleans these babies, but it also stuns them so they're not so fast to crawl away. He put the empty sieve on top of the pile of dirty dishes in the sink and brought a glass and a carton of milk to the table. I finally got my legs to move, and I made my way to the door. I stopped at the tattered screen door and turned to face him again. Old man Jordan was sitting there at his table, adjusting his napkin on his lap so he could chow on his worms. He looked at me and said, "You must stop back again sometime, boy. I'll be keeping my eye out for you." He then picked up his fork and carefully dug into the plate and picked up a nice load of worms which writhed in goo at the end of it. He raised the fork up and saluted me with it and said, "Bon appetit." And then, before I knew it, he greedily shoveled them into his mouth. I tried tearing my eyes away, but could not. I tried not to hear the awful slurping sounds his lips made as they smacked together again and again. Never before have my 14-year-old eyes seen such a repulsive sight. My body tightened and quivered as he gouged his fork into the slithering mass of worms again. Brown juice and worm blood squirted out of their impaled bodies and onto his face and neck. This seemed to give him great pleasure. The fork shrieked across his teeth as he backed it out of his full mouth. That awful chewing sound came again. Some of the slimy creatures crawled off the side of the plate, only to be scooped up with Jordan's fork. He poured himself a heaping glass of milk and washed them down with a good half a glass. Once again, I felt the vomit creeping up my throat. I held it down, tasting this afternoon's tuna sandwich from lunch. I backed into the door, still staring at old man Jordan and his favorite one-course meal. The door swung open behind me, and the cool night breeze drove my legs running. I took the stairs down 2 at a time and nearly fell down them. I dashed past the fallen garbage cans near the fence and onto the driveway, but I didn't stop running until I was out of breath. I wanted to throw up so bad, but it just wouldn't come up. I stopped walking at the beginning of my street to try to catch my breath. I stared back at old man Jordan's house, which was now well behind me. No one really knew just how crazy old man Jordan really was. I caught my breath and headed down the moonlit street. I couldn't wait to see the guys tomorrow. I would tell them everything I just saw. They would believe me, but not Mom and Dad. I would never tell them I was in old man Jordan's crazy house. No way. I walked down my wooded driveway and pushed open the front door, smelling the sweet sauce my mother had been simmering all day. In the kitchen, my brother and parents sat at the table already eating. I kicked off my shoes in the hallway and went to join them. I entered the kitchen and stopped in mid-step when I glanced on the table and saw what dinner was. In the center of the table, in a huge wooden bowl, was thick spaghetti drowning in Mom's thick red sauce. Only it wasn't spaghetti in my eyes. I saw thick, rubbery worms squirming around the bowl. They twisted and turned in their grotesque, slimy gel as Dad took a heaping forkful and shoveled them into his mouth. They twisted and turned on the inside of his mouth, leaving blood and slime on his lips until he sucked them in and chomped them to death. Afterward, he licked his lips with delight and complimented Mom on her marvelous cooking. But she was busy with her own invertebrates as she twirled her fork around her plate and devoured a mouthful of the wiggling brown worms. Worms! They were everywhere. I took a giant step back as my mother started to fix me a helping, poking the worms in the bowl with her fork and scooping a large pile onto a clean plate for me. I turned to the stainless steel sink, and finally, my stomach convulsing violently, lurched out a stream of gnarly vomit.